Well, good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is BRN Weekly for Saturday, February 8th, 2020. Earlier this week, I sat down with LinkedIn's Devin Banerjee to discuss data-driven marketing, whether or not it was removing the human element of pitching a product. Let's take a look.
We featured a story coming from an advertising executive, someone who used to run marketing at Google and Instagram, actually, and it's a really fascinating piece. What he's talking about is the evolution of this industry to a point where data has become such a central currency here that it's really kind of outstripped the importance and the relevance of the human element in marketing and advertising. So this is Eric Solomon, and he's writing in Entrepreneur Magazine, talking about his own personal experience. And he's been at YouTube, Spotify, Google, Instagram, and he did his PhD in quantitative methods around marketing and advertising. And what he's saying is that all these companies, all these advertising firms have become pure devotees of data. They're it's an emotion-free world at this point. And he says the effects are some of these ads we've seen recently from companies like Pepsi and Gillette and Audi that have immediate like you guys know, every couple of weeks there's an ad that is just faces immediate criticism, and as soon as it's out, people say, how could that happen? What kind of advertising or marketing team could sign off up the chain and let that go out into the world? And he says this is really driven by the over reliance on data, and people are not taking a step back and saying, what will the emotional connection to this advertisement be with actual people, with actual humans who we're trying to target. And so he's saying, as I said, that Facebook and Google have really driven this change where there's so many metrics and information available, so much data available. You and I spoke in December or November about Spotify and the podcast industry, which is now building all these tools for advertisers to get more data and do some of that attribution analysis. What is attributable to more views on ads and stuff like that. And all of that is just feeding this over-reliance on data. So it's super interesting. He actually quit the industry after a personal incident where his father died, and he was way too devoted to this stuff, and that people are really missing out on the human element of all of their work, but especially in the marketing and advertising industry. And Eric points to, he doesn't point to Apple in particular, but he points to these companies that are vision driven, and he really praises companies like that. He actually points out Nike, for an example, which has this vision that if you are a body, you are an athlete, and they start with a vision and then build their marketing and advertising around that, versus starting with just the data and ending with just the data. So his takeaway, his recommendation in this piece is for companies to have a vision, to embrace humility, to know that sometimes following the data is not the right course, and to be okay with that, and to be willing to experiment and test some human-driven strategies around marketing and advertising. But yeah, he points out Nike, and I'm sure he would agree with your take on Apple as well. So I mentioned some of those ads that have sparked some controversy, or at least humor and cynicism, like from Pepsi and Gillette. And a lot of young people were the first ones to come out and say, for Pepsi, they had Kendall Jenner, which is kind of a gimmick or a gotcha. Yeah. And young people say, this is a generalization, of course, young people say, well, I don't even drink soda anymore, so this is not going to change. It's not a vision or value I agree with. Or with Gillette, expensive razors. A lot of younger people have switched more to direct-to-consumer brands that are much cheaper, and they say, look, without a vision or value behind that, we're not going to give into your gimmick or gotcha advertisement. To flip that around as well, I've noticed influencers and public figures and athletes have actually become more perceptive themselves about what brands they choose to associate with. Yeah. And they're not just looking at the check that comes in and the amount written on it of that company, and if it stands for what they stand for as well. I was just watching a Roger Federer interview a couple months ago, who's my idol and legend in my mind, and he's now associated with a European shoe company called On, which is very small, and you would wonder, well, he's probably not getting a big check from them, although he invested an equity stake in them. But it was all about the values and the founders and the relationship he's built with them. And that's such a break from the mold of athletes maybe a decade or two ago just looking for the biggest brands, the soda brands, the consumer brands out there. I think athletes and public figures are more perceptive.
And I also sat down with the Motley Fool's Dan Klein about women in technology and how to increase their numbers. Let's take a look.
It's harder as a man to see this, and I work for an incredibly progressive company. The Motley Fool is as welcoming a place as could be. So there's women in leadership, there's women in technology positions, but I've also worked at other companies and coders are men. You just don't see a lot of women. So this is really about opening up opportunity and taking jobs that, this isn't running back in the NFL. There's no reason a man or a woman would be treated any differently in these fields. It's sort of about creating opportunity, and that's a good thing, because if we had twice as many coders as we have now, we still wouldn't have enough coders for all of the jobs available. And with technology, you want different opinions, because you and I might look at something a certain way. Like, hey, I want this. When I go to, I don't know, let's give an example. When I go to a restaurant, I want to be able to order via a kiosk and have it work this way. And perhaps my wife would look at it and say, boy, I have a totally different opinion. I would like this level of convenience. So you need to hear different voices. You need to look at different things. And it's always good for any company to put people who maybe don't agree together to figure out a solution that works for both of them. And this is something you see all the time in the tech world. Hackathons, come together for a day. We're all going to stay up to think of ideas. And at the end of it, some of them are good ideas. Some of them are bad. Some of them will become companies. Some of them won't. And getting more voices, having women be part of that is important, because, again, if I listed out my 5 biggest problems in the day, I'm not entirely sure they're the same as the ones my wife would list out, and they're definitely not the same as the ones maybe our mothers would list out. So you want to get all these different opinions in. You want to hear all these people from the technology side, and then give them the tools to solve the problem. And, look, the world is really tilted towards us. Like, if you are a middle-aged white male, Homer Simpson joked about this once and pulled out Gum and Nuts together at last, everyone is listening to us, and maybe it's important to hear some other voices. It's very important to open every door, and that goes in all directions. Fields that were traditionally, female-oriented, obviously are now open to men, and men and women need to kick down the doors in technology and other spaces to be inclusive, because that's going to create better things for all of us. I don't think you can be a good business if you don't reflect your customer base. So if you're a big company, if you're Microsoft, if you're Google, you're not serving just 46-year-old white men. You're serving absolutely everybody. So you want absolutely everybody represented in that tent, because there are going to be things that you and I don't see that a different opinion, a different person might see. And that's very important, and it's really good to see these walls kind of falling down.
And when we come back, I talk to Rob Beamer of the state of Nevada. Yes, I said it right, and you're going to want to see this interview with Rob and learn more about how Nevada is helping its public servants save more for retirement. So stay tuned right here on BRN Weekly. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms? Especially for the smaller businesses. I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. and we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network. Welcome back. On Wednesday, I sat down with the state of Nevada's Rob Beamer to learn about how the state is helping public servants save for retirement. Let's take a look.
So yeah, we at the state of Nevada here for the longest time, the program has been in existence, I should say, since the late 70s. But for the longest time, our committee that's appointed by our governor, they kind of ran the program, if you will, on the corner of their desk. I know people from the DOL and and other regulatory agencies would probably love to hear that, right? But for the longest time, while we were young, they and early in our stages, they kind of ran the program on the corner of the desk while they were doing other duties. In the 80s, if you will, the late 80s, the legislature passed us being able to have professional staff on staff to kind of handle the program, the day-to-day operation and whatnot. And we've continued with that successfully up to this point. And about 2 or 3 years ago, the legislature again moved our program from being directly under the governor's office to under the Department of Administration. So the director of the Department of Administration and myself, we kind of work together to make sure that the day-to-day operations are happening, as well as that, we're marketing our program as a viable benefit to state of Nevada employees. So it's we have not only state of Nevada employees, but we have the Nevada System of Higher Education, which brings in all of our higher ed folks. And then we also service and have as part of our program many of the political subdivisions throughout the state of Nevada, all but I think 5 or 6 political subdivisions, which would be the cities, counties, general improvement districts, smaller government entities that participate, maybe don't have huge force, where they can't drive, the good pricing and good administration of the plan. They can join our plan and through a joinder agreement, and we accept them and they work with us and follow our plan documents and rules and all that stuff. The cool thing is because we have such a robust, like you alluded to, because we have such a robust defined benefit plan with Nevada PERS, which most individuals can retire with 30 years of service credit and make 75% income replacement of their 3 highest average consecutive years of income throughout their career. That's pretty amazing. So deferred comp really becomes really probably one of the most valuable voluntary benefits that we have available to government employees here in the state of Nevada. The thing that we're trying to do now is we're really trying to drive that financial wellness component and if you will, kind of catch up to what we're seeing in today's age, right? And also trying to predict out, in the future of what kind of income replacement are individuals going to need when they retire in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, right?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges with regard to trying to figure that out, and what kind of accumulation do we need to make happen now to be able to warrant that income replacement in 15, 20, 30 years when a person's going to need it, right? When I get people that apply for board appointments, I go in and I kind of look and see what kind of fiscal background do they have? Do they have something that helps understand, that will help them understand fiscal management? We kind of feel like, because we have such a great investment consultant that we contract with, and with the assistance of our awesome record keeper, right, that we have currently, they play a huge part in helping me to be able to train our board members to be able to act in that fiduciary capacity, make those fiduciary decisions when it comes to not only plan design, but more importantly, investment management, selection, that sort of thing. So it's been definitely a learning curve for me because I came from the industry, if you will, and understanding how that process works. And then, you add on the bureaucracy that's natural in government, in the public sector, especially in a state entity, right? And there's been a big learning curve for me to help us get committee members or board members that are that just function well, and they make good, prudent decisions that are good on behalf of all the participant base, not just for the sector that they represent, if you will, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
we feel real good about that right now. The committee we have currently and past committees we've had have just done such a great job, and that in conjunction with our contractors, with our investment consultant and our record keeping team, we all do a great job, I think, of making that big team that really drives these outcomes and makes it the most beneficial program for government and state employees across the great state of Nevada.
And in our last segment, I sit down with the University of California's Marco Mers to get his perspective on the Secure Act, retirement income, and alternative investments. Let's take a look.
One of the first comments that I'll make, Jeff, is that obviously we've been talking for years about guaranteed income. So I think this is more of a conversation than actual implementation. But I think that needs to be addressed. For us, this has an increased level of urgency because of that structure that we talked about earlier. We are now offering participants defined contribution only. We are a hyper-paternalistic entity, and many of our stakeholders, including our board, including our academic senate, really have heartache around participants not having some form of guaranteed income stream. So we're researching and working heavily around guaranteed income. As a matter of fact, we're meeting on Friday with our board to talk about the incorporation of a deferred annuity into the target date fund. What we want to do is ensure that our participants are hedged when it comes to longevity risk, in particular in the latter stages of their life when cognitive abilities are declining. So we believe a floor, an income guarantee, in particular around 78 and beyond, is where we really need to get this right. And so our idea is that we will leverage our target date fund. We will incorporate a deferred annuity, a QLAC, into the target date fund to allow participants to really get a baseline floor above and beyond Social Security, when in our view it matters most. If you're 66 and you're starting to realize you've overspent and maybe you're starting to run out of money, it's easier to counter steer and say, let's go back to work. You can't do that when you're 78 or 80. So we really believe that that tail of your longevity risk is critically important. And that's the area where we're working hard to improve our target date fund. We're not talking about it or only talking about it. And we are actively working it with our record keeper, with our glide path manager, SSGA, to incorporate a QLAC. From a timeline perspective, the rollout of the communication will start late 2020, and the first QLAC purchase opportunity for our participants will be in 2021. So from us in our entity, we have moved from a conceptual conversation to an actual implementation strategy. And again, we believe the longer tail of longevity risk is really where we need to hone in. And we believe that's a sweet spot. We're helping participants hedge that longevity risk at the end of their life, but also retain liquidity and flexibility for them between 62 and 78. Because when you talk to participants, they love guaranteed income, but at the same time, they value flexibility, liquidity of assets. And so we believe this is a sweet spot. We retain a large amount of assets in a liquid, diversified portfolio. They can buy and sell it, but we also add a QLAC to give them that income floor when it matters. And this goes well beyond just the QLAC or our target date fund. Again, we're very paternalistic. We don't want to get retirees or people that have left the university. We don't want them out of our plan, out of our 403B, our 457 plan, because we firmly believe they're not going to be able to get those economies of scale anywhere else. I'll give you an example. Our US large cap equity strategy, we pay half a basis point for that, right? You cannot go out into the market as an individual on the retail side to get that type of cost. So if you want to step back a little bit and think about alts a little more broadly, not our view only, is that you've had some plan sponsors try it, they ended up being litigated, and so there's been this tremendous headwind around alternatives, which in my view is really a shame. The reality is, and I think the consensus from everyone that you will talk to, Jeff, and I'm sure you've heard this, is lower expected returns, lower returns for fixed income, lower returns for public equity. That has a meaningful impact when it comes to wealth accumulation. So the question that we all need to ask ourselves is, how can we ensure that expected returns are as large as possible, obviously risk controlled? And I do believe that we have a too tight of a funnel in defined contribution by excluding, in particular, private equity and private real estate. I think we're a poster child of the almost schizophrenic approach to defined benefit and defined contribution management. I am participant in our defined benefit plan. So for Marco on the DB side, private equity, private real estate, absolute returns strategies, real asset strategies are good and important and part of my implicit portfolio. But the same Marco that now has assets in the DC plan shouldn't hold them. Doesn't make sense. Too expensive, too risky. That's a complete disconnect. So in our view, incorporating alternatives is going to be extremely important as we go down the road, and in our view, will start seeing lower returns into the future. So we are extremely interested in adding alts. Obviously, there's some operational challenges there. Fees are one of them. I think that's a lesser problem. Sometimes you hear around liquidity, they're not liquid. If they're incorporated in a target date fund, I don't think liquidity is really an argument. You will hear fair valuation as a challenge or a problem, where people will tell you, well, you shouldn't include it because you can't fair value it. So we've done some research around that. How can you strike an artificial NAV for private assets? So there's a whole bunch of work that we're doing. We believe down the road, alternative assets need to be in a target date fund, need to be in a defined contribution plan. I'll give you one anecdotal point around this. When we talk on the DB side and our endowment to our private managers, doesn't matter who it is. If you talk to a Sequoia in the venture space, if you talk to Apollo or Blackstone in the more mid to large buyout space, one theme that is consistent, they will tell you companies stay private for longer. And if that is true, if wealth creation, if equity growth happens on the private side, a DC plan without exposure to alternatives will miss out and will lose that opportunity for growth. So if that premise does play out, and we are starting to see that wealth creation happens on the private side because Sequoia will sell their venture funds that are starting to mature. Rather than IPOing a fund, they're actually selling it to their growth fund, and it stays private longer. That means that equity growth is happening on the private side, not on the public side. It's a real problem for defined contribution. Obviously, this needs to be done right, needs to be done on a risk-adjusted basis. But nonetheless, it is mission critical down the road, in our view, to incorporate alternatives. And you, me, the industry as a whole needs to think about how do we tackle this and really put all of our minds together. And from a plan sponsor, asset manager, from an industry perspective like you, an industry leader, we need to think about how do we approach this as one team to ensure that alts are not forgotten or simply because there's perceived headwinds not addressed and not incorporated. So we're bullish on alternatives in DC. It will take time, but to me it's a no-brainer.
Well, certainly great segments, great contributors, and great shows all around, but we've got more to come next week. And that wraps up this episode of BRN Weekly. But we're not done, because tomorrow we've got our podcast, BRN Sunday, where members of the media, academia, and financial services tackle all the news in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, and so much more. You're not going to want to miss it. Great show, I can tell you that. So until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.